Today, we're going to look at a really unusual argument for the Book of Mormon. It's one that doesn't focus on the epic battles or the grand prophecies. Instead, it finds evidence in the book's strange, kind of awkward, and just plain messy details. And it all starts with a bit of a head-scratcher right in the text itself. It's about this ancient people, the Jaredites. And the question is pretty simple. Why does the Book of Mormon seem to tell the story of their downfall not once, but twice, in two different ways? You see, these two accounts come from two totally different sources mentioned in the book. On one hand, you've got this mysterious, engraved, large stone. And on the other, a much more detailed set of 24 gold plates. And get this, they both tell the same basic story about the end of the Jaredite civilization.
Now, what's really crucial here is just how different these two things are. The large stone, think of it like a public monument, a quick little epitaph found early on, but the 24 plates, which show up way later, they're the complete opposite, a full sacred history from A to Z.
And this gets us to the million-dollar question that the source material asks. If you're a writer in the 1800s just making all this up, why would you invent this large stone, this basically redundant record, just to mention it and then never bring it up again? It's a total loose end. So that leads us right into our first section, fiction versus messy history. The whole argument from our source, Alan Spedding, is that these weird little inconsistencies and loose ends, they're not mistakes. He says they're actually fingerprints of authenticity. The key idea here is something scholars call undesigned coincidences. It sounds fancy, but it's simple. It's all the little random details, the weird omissions, and the untidy loose ends that you find all over real historical accounts, but that a good fiction writer would almost always clean up. Think about it this way. Polished fiction, especially from the 19th century, wants a smooth story. Every detail serves the plot, no loose ends. But real history, the source argues it's often messy, right? It's full of fragments, names and places that are never fully explained, and yeah, even redundant information. Okay, let's move into section 2, because this is where the case starts to build. The author argues that this whole large stone business isn't just a one-off curiosity. Nope, it's actually part of a much bigger pattern of weird stuff all through the Book of Mormon. So, for example, have you ever heard of Shazer? It's a place name that pops up once, just once, while a family is wandering in the Arabian wilderness. It's never explained, never mentioned again. So why put it in? Well, much later, linguists pointed out a plausible Arabic root, Shajer, which means a place with trees. A perfect description, but a detail that would have been pretty much impossible for Joseph Smith to know back in 1829.
Or how about the name Alma? In the book, Alma is a major male prophet. For decades, critics just laughed at this. Alma's a girl's name, they'd say, because in the 19th century, it was a feminine Latin name. But then, in the 20th century, ancient texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and guess what? Alma was, in fact, an authentic male name back then. What looked like a huge blunder is now presented as a direct historical hit.
And here's a different kind of weirdness. The brother of Jared is the hero of a whole section of the book, but we never learn his name. Think about that. If you were writing a story, wouldn't you give your main character a cool, heroic name? Of course you would. But a translator, working from an ancient text that just didn't have the name, well, they'd leave it out, exactly as they found it. Okay, one last quick one that shows a different kind of messiness, troop counts. So this army of young warriors is introduced, and it's not about 2,000 of them, it's exactly 2,000. And later, when they get reinforcements, it's a specific 60 more guys, making the total 2,060. The source argues this kind of fussy, specific detail feels less like a grand story and a lot more like a real military report.
But of course, not all of these oddities are created equal. Some are more compelling than others. And that brings us to section 3, weighing the evidence. Here, the author of our source tries to actually rank these examples based on how strongly they point to authenticity.
And to do that, he came up with a pretty simple scoring system, just a scale from 1 to 50. A score of 1 is like, that's interesting, but it's not strong evidence. A score of 50, though, that's what he considers an extremely powerful fingerprint of authenticity. So let's see how our examples stack up. He gives the male name Alma a perfect 50, calling it a direct bullseye that Joseph Smith just couldn't have faked. The place name Shazer gets a super high 45. And our original puzzle piece, the large stone, that comes in at a solid 35. Still really strong evidence, in his view, precisely because it's so literarily awkward. And this all brings us to the final part of the whole argument in section 4, the cumulative case. See, the author's big point isn't about any single gotcha detail. It's about what happens when you take all these little, weird, messy threads and look at them together. The logic basically builds like this. You find one strange detail? Okay, maybe it's a coincidence. You find a couple, maybe they're just literary quirks. But when you start finding a dozen or more of these things scattered all through the book, and they all point to the same kind of messiness you see in real history, well, the author argues you're left with a pattern that gets really hard to explain away as just something a guy in the 1800s made up. And this is all wrapped up perfectly in this fantastic final thought from the author, Alan Spedding. He says, "Together, they form a web of incidental credibility that looks much more like translation than invention." So in the end, we're left with that big question. Do all these messy edges, the extra records, the forgotten names, the super specific numbers, do they really weave together a compelling web of evidence? Or are they just the kind of random quirks you'd expect to find in any long, complex book? It's a fascinating and definitely unconventional way to think about where the Book of Mormon came from.